Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. The story I'm about to share is one of the heaviest I've ever told, and I want to prepare you. It won't be easy to hear. There are monsters that don't lurk under beds or hide in closets. They sit with you at the dinner table, bow their heads before meals, and call themselves family. My name is Margaret Ann Williams, and I am now 78 years old. For more than half a century, I've carried a silence so heavy it has bent my shoulders and shadowed my life. I was born and raised in a small rural town in Georgia, where the summer heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, and family secrets were guarded tighter than land deeds. Most people here know me only as Grandma Maggie, the old woman with white hair who sells pies every Saturday at the farmer's market and never misses the 6 church service. But what no one sees is what I've held inside since I was just 10 years old. Today, I feel it's finally time to share my truth. Not for myself, I've learned how to carry this weight, but for all the children who, like me, had their innocence stolen by the very people who should have kept them safe. Maybe by hearing this, someone out there will find the strength to break the silence before it becomes a lifelong prison. My childhood home was a simple wooden house, painted pale blue, with a porch where my mother placed red geraniums in old pots. We lived modestly, just like most families around us. My father, Edward Williams, worked long days in the cotton fields, leaving before sunrise and returning only when stars dotted the sky. My mother, Helen, cared for the house, baked bread and pies to sell, and tended to us children. I was the oldest of 3. After me came my brother David, 2 years younger, and my little sister Lucy, who had just turned 5. Life was simple then, poor but sprinkled with small joys. The smell of bread baking in the oven, the bedtime stories Mama would tell us, and cooling off in the creek on scorching afternoons. But everything changed on May 12th, 1957. That morning began grey, with an endless drizzle that soaked the earth. I woke to the sound of Mama's coughing, deep, raw, unnatural. When I went to their room, I saw her pale, feverish face, her lips tinted blue. "Are you okay, Mama?" I whispered, terrified. She tried to smile, but even that seemed to hurt her. "Just the flu, my flower. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. By midday her fever had spiked, her breathing ragged and shallow. My father, who had stayed home because of the rain, watched her with a growing fear in his eyes. "I'm taking her to the hospital in Fairview," he finally said, naming the nearest town with a small clinic. "Maggie, you're in charge of your brother and sister until I get back." Living with us at the time was my grandfather, Walter Williams, who had moved in after my grandmother died 8 months earlier. He was a tall, broad man of 68, with a grey moustache, calloused hands, and eyes that carried a cold, measuring sharpness. "I'll watch the little ones," he told my father, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Go on, Edward, take care of Helen." My father nodded, bundled Mama in blankets, and carried her to the truck. I will never forget her face in that moment, ashen against the dark fabric, her eyes locking with mine one final time. "Take care of your siblings, Maggie," she whispered weakly. "I'll be back soon." But she never came back. The days stretched endlessly, the rain drumming on the roof like an omen. I tried to keep life normal for David and Lucy, made them a simple lunch, told stories, played games. Grandpa sat on the porch, smoking his pipe, staring into the storm. By nightfall, worry gnawed at me. Why weren't they back yet? Had the roads washed out? At around 9 p.m, I heard the crunch of wheels in the muddy yard. Heart pounding, I ran to the window, only to see my father, alone, drenched in rain. When he entered, I knew instantly. His red, swollen eyes, his bent, defeated posture. He held his hat against his chest like a man in mourning. "Where's Mama?" I asked, my voice trembling. He swallowed hard. "Helen didn't make it, sweetheart. Pneumonia. It was too far gone." The world collapsed. Just that morning, she had been there, smiling faintly through her fever, and now she was gone forever. My father pulled me into his arms, his wet clothes soaking my dress. We clung to each other in grief, while from the kitchen doorway Grandpa stood watching, his face as cold and unreadable as stone. That night stretched longer than any before, and before the sun rose again, everything I thought I knew about safety, family, and childhood would shatter completely. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, just as Mama used to do. It was the morning of her wake, and I knew soon the house would be filled with neighbours and relatives. Keeping a routine was my only refuge, the only way to stop myself from completely falling apart. My father was already awake, his eyes red and swollen, his face marked by a night of tears. He pulled me into his arms again, and I had to summon every bit of newfound strength not to break down in his embrace, not to scream out the truth about what had happened. "I'm going to bring your mother home now," he whispered hoarsely. "Take care of the little ones when they wake up." I nodded, almost mechanically. Take care of the little ones. That's what I would do from that day on. Take care of my brother and sister, and keep silent. Because who would believe me? Who would dare stand against the word of a respected man like my grandfather? And how could I pile more pain on my father, who had just lost the love of his life? That was the day my long winter of silence began, the day I lost my mother and much more. The day I learned in the cruelest way that the world is not a safe place, especially for a young girl. The day I discovered that sometimes monsters carry our very own blood, and I stayed quiet for so long that I almost forgot what it was like to have a voice, until something happened that changed everything. The days after Mama's burial passed like a thick fog rolling over the Georgia fields in winter. The wake was a blur of faces, hugs that couldn't warm me, and words of comfort that never reached my ears. I only remember the simple wooden coffin, pale in colour, my mother's face inside, too still, too serene, like a wax doll instead of the vibrant woman who used to hum while kneading dough. I remember clutching my siblings' hands with all my strength. My brother David, only 8, understood enough to cry without pause. My little sister Lucy, far too young to grasp death, kept asking again and again when Mama would wake up, each question twisted in my chest like a knife. In our small community, grief carried its own rituals. The women filled our pantry with food that could last weeks. Fresh bread, jars of preserves, pies, sausages, cheeses. The men took turns helping my father with the farm work, knowing he couldn't manage it all in those first weeks. That solidarity was the only comfort I had. But slowly, the visits stopped. Life pressed forward, and everyone returned to their routines. Within a week after the burial, it was just us again. A grieving father, 3 motherless children, and a grandfather whose eyes followed me everywhere like a predator in the dark. My father, consumed by sorrow, hardly noticed what was happening under his own roof. He left before dawn, came back at dusk, and collapsed into bed with no energy for anything else. Work was his only escape. Maybe he thought that if he tired himself enough, he wouldn't dream of Mama at night. "You're being a good girl, Maggie," he sometimes told me, running his hand over my hair. "Your Mama would be proud." Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they burned. If he knew what happened while he was gone, would he still look at me with pride in his eyes? I took over Mama's role as best I could. I woke early to prepare breakfast, helped David and Lucy get ready for the little country school 2 miles away, washed clothes in the stone basin, and cooked the recipes I had learned from watching her. But nothing came out right. The beans never tasted the same. The bread wouldn't rise. The clothes weren't as white. Each failure was a sharp reminder of her absence. At night, when everyone else was asleep, I buried my face in the pillow, crying silently so I wouldn't wake Lucy, who slept beside me. I cried for Mama. I cried for myself. I cried for the crushing weight of responsibilities on my small shoulders. But most of all, I cried for the terror that grew inside me each time I found myself alone with my grandfather. After that first night, he became more careful, more methodical. He waited until my father was gone into town, until my siblings were at school or playing with neighbours. There was always an excuse. "Come help me here, Maggie," he would say in that rough voice that allowed no refusal. And I would go, trembling, knowing what awaited me. Because what choice did a 10-year-old girl have in a time when children had no voice? When the word of an adult, especially a respected man, was law? Afterward, his words were always the same. "This stays between us. Your father has enough burdens already. You don't want to cause him more suffering, do you?" And so he silenced me, turning my love for my father into a weapon against me. I believed that if I told the truth, it would break my father completely. That if our fragile family collapsed, it would be my fault. The months dragged on in that endless nightmare. Winter came hard that year, frost whitening the fields at dawn, nights so cold we could see our breath inside the house. On the harshest days, I almost welcomed the cold, grateful for the extra layers of clothing that gave me one more barrier between myself and his hands. Over time, I learned to escape in my mind. While my body was trapped, my spirit fled to the places Mama once took us. Fields of spring flowers, cool creeks, dreams of a future where I'd be big enough to run away with my siblings. It was survival through dissociation. But when I turned 11 that August, new horror set in. My body began to change, small, tender buds forming on my chest, early puberty, and he noticed. "Turning into a young lady, huh?" Grandpa muttered one day, his gaze crawling over me like insects. "Your mama developed early too." His words made me sick. I tried everything to hide, wearing loose clothes, hunching my shoulders, binding my chest, but nothing could stop his eyes. That summer, we began receiving frequent visits from my father's cousin, Aunt Louise, a widow in her 50s. She came on Sundays, bringing cakes and candies, and she watched us with sharp, knowing eyes. "This girl's too thin," she remarked to my father once, "and those eyes, they belong to someone far older than her years." It was the first time anyone had noticed. A flicker of hope lit inside me, mixed with panic. I wanted her to discover everything, to take the weight away, but I also feared the storm it would bring if no one believed me. Grandpa sensed the danger Aunt Louise posed. He became cautious when she was around, treating me with a cold, calculated distance that could be mistaken for respect. But his eyes told me otherwise. I remained silent. Still, I began small acts of rebellion. I slept with scissors under my pillow. I locked the bedroom door before dawn. I pretended to be sick if I'd be left alone with him. Most of all, I learned to observe, to predict his moods, to hide before he could find me. I even discovered a loft in the barn, my secret refuge he never knew about. Almost a year passed like this. Then, in March 1958, something happened that would change the course of my life forever. It was a Saturday. My father had gone into town to sell produce and buy supplies. David and Lucy were at a neighbour's birthday party. I was alone at home with him. I was scrubbing out the wood stove when I heard his voice behind me. "Come here, Margaret," he ordered in that tone that allowed no refusal. My heart raced. I knew that voice too well. But something in me snapped that day. Maybe it was the exhaustion of living in fear for so long. Maybe it was the memory of Mama that felt especially close that morning. Maybe I had just reached the end of what I could endure. "I can't right now," I muttered, still scrubbing, refusing to look at him. "I need to finish this before Dad gets back." He froze, shocked. I had never dared disobey him before. But his surprise quickly turned into rage. In 3 long strides, he grabbed my arm with a crushing grip and began dragging me toward his room. "Who do you think you are, talking back to me like that?" he growled through clenched teeth. "Forgot who's in charge while your father's gone?" I struggled, clawing and kicking, but my small body was no match for his brute strength. Still, something inside me snapped. If it was going to happen again, then at least I wouldn't be submissive this time. That's when we both heard the crunch of wheels in the yard. My grandfather froze, his grip still like iron around my arm. We weren't expecting anyone. Then suddenly he shoved me hard against the stove. "Go see who it is, and not a word," he hissed. Heart pounding, I ran to the window. Relief flooded through me. It was my father's truck, arriving earlier than expected. Never had that faded red pickup looked so beautiful. Grandpa slipped quickly into his room while I tried to compose myself. I smoothed my apron, fixed my hair, and forced a deep breath to hold back the tears burning my eyes. My father came in, carrying groceries and a small package wrapped in brown paper. Later I'd find out it was a piece of fabric for a new dress. His face, usually shadowed by grief since Mum's passing, seemed lighter than usual. "I came back early," he explained, setting the bags on the table. "Storms rolling in. I didn't want to risk getting stuck." Dark clouds were already thick on the horizon, promising one of those summer storms that turn dirt roads into muddy traps. I helped put the groceries away, pretending nothing was wrong, though my arm throbbed from where Grandpa had crushed it, and my heartbeat refused to calm. Dad's eyes lingered on me as we worked. At one point, his hand brushed the exact spot on my arm where angry red marks stood out. I flinched, a soft cry escaping before I could stop it. "What happened here, Ellie?" he asked, frowning deeply. "Nothing," I blurted. I banged it under the table while cleaning. But he didn't look convinced. His gaze, so much like mine, studied me with quiet intensity. "Is there something going on that I should know about?" he asked gently but firmly. The words stuck in my throat. This was my chance to tell him everything, to finally end it. But fear silenced me. Fear of being doubted. Fear of tearing apart what was left of our family. "No, Dad, everything's fine," I whispered, lowering my eyes. He sighed, clearly unconvinced, but let it go. He stroked my hair briefly before heading to check on Grandpa. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, but the storm inside me was worse. Guilt for staying silent, relief for escaping this time, and something new that I hardly dared name. Hope. Dad had noticed. He had asked. Maybe not all was lost, but what I didn't know then was that the real storm, the one that would tear through our family, was only just beginning. The next days were tense, every moment thick with unspoken fear. Grandpa avoided being alone with me. For the first time I saw hesitation in his eyes, something between menace and unease. Dad, meanwhile, seemed to awaken from the fog of grief. He started coming home earlier, paying attention to details he used to miss, watching me closely as if trying to solve a puzzle written on my face. I often overheard hushed arguments between him and Grandpa, conversations that stopped dead when I entered the room. Life went on, cooking, cleaning, sewing, looking after my younger siblings. But the routine felt brittle, fragile. Grandpa's opportunities to corner me grew fewer, not because he stopped trying, but because Dad began appearing at unexpected moments, always near when it mattered. Then, one cold April night, everything changed. My siblings were asleep, and I was washing dishes by the glow of the kerosene lamp. The only sounds were the crickets outside and the soft crackle of the stove fire. Grandpa entered quietly, with that heavy, deliberate tread I had grown to dread. Dad had stepped outside to check a noise in the shed, or so he said. Looking back, I realised it was a set-up. "Alone, Ellie?" Grandpa rasped behind me. A shiver of terror ran down my spine. I kept my hands moving, drying dishes, pretending nothing was happening, as if the routine could shield me. "It's been too long since we've had time together," he whispered, coming closer. I felt his breath, whiskey and tobacco, on my neck as his hands pressed onto my shoulders. My legs nearly gave out, but then... "What's going on here?" Dad's voice cut through the silence, sharp and furious in a way I had never heard before. I turned, wide-eyed, to see him standing in the doorway, anger and disbelief written across his face. Grandpa jerked his hands back as though burned. "Nothing, son," he said too quickly. "Just talking with the girl." Talking? Dad's voice was low but dangerous. "That didn't look like talking." The kitchen fell into suffocating silence, broken only by the stove crackling. I froze with a dish in my hand, unable to move. "Go to your room, Ellie," Dad ordered, his eyes never leaving Grandpa. I hesitated, torn between relief and fear of what would come next. "Go," he repeated more firmly. I dropped the plate and hurried past him, but instead of going to my room, I lingered in the hallway shadows, my heart hammering. "What were you doing with my daughter?" Dad's voice demanded. "I told you, nothing, just talking," Grandpa replied, though his voice quivered. "Am I imagining things?" Dad's tone darkened. "The bruises on her arms, the way she recoils when you get near, the nightmares. She's clumsy, always hurting herself, and the nightmares, she lost her mother. That's normal." "Don't take me for a fool!" Dad's voice erupted, making me flinch. "Last night I stayed awake. I saw you try to go into her room. I heard her tell you to leave. Don't you dare lie to me." A stunned silence followed. Then Grandpa tried again, his tone smooth, almost pleading. "You don't understand. She confuses things. Without a mother, she misinterprets. She—" "Shut your mouth," Dad roared. Something crashed, glass or a plate. "Don't you dare accuse my daughter of lies!" "I didn't do anything she didn't want," Grandpa spat back, his tone shifting to defiance. "She's been tempting me for months. She's a woman before her time, just like her mother." The next sound was like thunder inside the kitchen, a fist striking flesh. Furniture scraped, dishes shattered, and the air filled with the sounds of a brutal fight. I pressed my hands over my ears, trembling, but couldn't block it out. Grunts of pain, wood splintering, glass breaking. Then a heavy crash, followed by silence. Driven by panic, I ran back toward the kitchen doorway. The image burned itself into my mind forever. My father stood in the kitchen, chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. On the dirt floor lay my grandfather, lifeless, sprawled out, a dark pool of blood spreading beneath his head where it had struck the edge of the wood stove. "Dad!" The word barely escaped my lips, little more than a whisper. He turned toward me, and for a fleeting second his eyes looked hollow, as if he didn't recognize me at all, staring through me into some void. Then, slowly, recognition returned. "Ellie," he said hoarsely, his voice breaking apart. "I told you to go to your room. Is he—" The rest of the question stuck in my throat. My father dropped to his knees, pressing two trembling fingers against my grandfather's neck. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity before giving a grave nod. "Go wake Paul," he said at last, his tone suddenly steady and practical, so out of place in the chaos that filled the room. "Tell him you didn't hear anything, that you were asleep. Do you understand? Whatever happens, you saw nothing. You heard nothing." I nodded, my whole body shaking. Terror still clung to me, but behind it crept a strange, guilty relief. My grandfather was gone. That nightmare was finished, but another one had only just begun. "And Ellie," my father added, gripping my shoulders firmly and locking eyes with me, "someday, when you're older, I'll ask you what really happened tonight, and when that day comes, you'll tell me the truth. But not now, not today. Today you saw nothing. Promise me." "I promise, Dad," I replied, my voice sounding older, steadier than I ever felt. The rest of the night blurred like a fever dream. I remember shaking Paul awake, whispering to him the story we were supposed to tell, that nothing had disturbed us, that we'd been asleep. I remember going back to my room, pulling Rosie into my arms while, by some miracle, she still slept soundly through the chaos. I remember the sound of horses outside, the crunch of boots on dirt, men's voices low and cautious, lantern lights slipping through the cracks of the shutters. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a bristling moustache, came in and spoke in hushed tones. The doctor bent over my grandfather's body right there on the kitchen floor before they carried him out. "It was an accident, Ernest," the sheriff muttered to my father. Anybody can see the old man slipped, hit his head. Happens all the time, especially after whiskey. Maybe the sheriff believed it, or maybe he simply didn't want to wade into a fight between father and son in a town where everybody knew each other. Either way, the story stuck. Officially, August Thompson, aged 69, had stumbled in a drunken haze, struck the stove, and died instantly. A tragic household accident. No questions asked. Or if doubts existed, no one dared speak them, not with the grief of my mother's death still fresh over our family. The wake was short, sparsely attended. A few townsfolk, some of my grandfather's old acquaintances. No real tears, no heartfelt mourning. My father stood through it all, stiff and controlled, carrying himself with the dignity of a man doing what was required, not what he desired. I, meanwhile, felt detached, as though watching strangers act out a play. And when the plain coffin was lowered into the ground in the small cemetery, I felt something heavy lift off me, as if the earth had swallowed not just my grandfather, but the months of fear he had cast over our lives. That night, after the burial, when the house finally quieted and my siblings slept, my father sat me down at the same kitchen table where it had all ended. The floor was spotless, scrubbed until no trace of blood remained, but we both knew what had happened there. "Ellie," he began, his voice low and tired, "I won't ask you to tell me anything. I don't want to put that weight on you. Just know this. If I did what I did, it was because a father protects his children, always, against anyone, against anything." His eyes shimmered with tears he refused to let fall, the first true crack in his hardened exterior since that night. He reached across the table and took my hand. "One day, if you want to speak of it, I'll be here, and if you never wish to, that's all right too. The only thing that matters now is that we're safe." "We did what we had to do," I answered, surprising even myself with the strength in my voice. "And we're alive. That's what counts." He looked at me as if really seeing me for the first time. "You've got your mother's strength," he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at his weary face. "She'd be proud." In that moment, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen lamp, a silent pact formed between us. Words weren't necessary. And that night, for the first time in almost a year, I slept without fear, without nightmares, without the shadow of a monster lurking under the same roof. But secrets, no matter how deep they're buried, have a way of surfacing again. I didn't know it then, but that chapter, though closed, was far from over. Healing would take decades, and life would test me in ways I couldn't have imagined on that fragile night of peace. As time moved forward, the house slowly shifted from a place of dread back into something resembling a home. Shadows lingered, clinging to walls like stains that soap could never scrub away. Then came the summer of 1958, scorching and relentless, cracking the earth by day and suffocating us with humid nights. Yet inside me, something softened, as though a long frozen winter was giving way to a hesitant spring. My father, though we never spoke again of that night, began rebuilding our family with quiet determination. His rough, calloused hands, made for farm work, clumsily learned tenderness. He braided Rosie's hair in the mornings, checked Paul's schoolwork in the evenings, even attempted cakes on Sundays, following my mother's old recipe cards. Neighbours chuckled, teasing him about turning into a homemaker. He only shrugged and said, "My children need me, so I learn." In 1958, rural Georgia, that was nearly unheard of, a widower baking bread or patching clothes. As for me, though I shouldered many of the house chores, my father refused to let me abandon school. "Your mother wanted you educated," he'd remind me whenever I protested, "and I want that too." Returning to the little one-room schoolhouse under Miss Martha's watchful eye was both a comfort and a challenge. It meant time away from the house, among children who would never know the truth of what had happened there, but at 11 I carried experiences that built a wall between me and them. "Eleanor seems far away," Miss Martha once told my father. "She's bright, quick to learn, but her mind drifts, like she's living half in another world." She was right. A part of me was always guarded, always scanning for threats, distrustful of easy kindness. The nightmares still came, though less often. Some nights I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, and in those moments it was my father who came, sitting silently by my bed until my breathing steadied. "It's all right, Ellie," he'd whisper. "Just a dream. No one will hurt you. Not ever again." He never asked what the dream was. He didn't need to. We both knew. Then, in early 1960, when I was 13, life shifted again. My Aunt Louise, my father's distant cousin, lost her second husband and was left alone in her large house in Fairview. One Sunday afternoon, over sweet tea on the porch, she made a suggestion that would change everything. "Ernest," she said gently, "why don't you and the children come live with me in town? The house is too big for one person, and the kids would have better schools." My father stroked his stubbled chin, hesitation etched across his face. "I don't know, Louise. This land is all I've got. My father's and his father's before him." "Nobody's saying you need to sell the place," Aunt Louise replied matter-of-factly. "Hire someone to tend the land. Visit when you want. But think about the children, Ernest. What kind of future do they have stuck out here? Eleanor's nearly a young woman. She deserves schooling, not a life that ends with her scrubbing floors for someone else." Her words pierced my father. If there was one thing he longed for, it was to give us the chances he and my mother had never known. He didn't decide that afternoon, but the thought began to take root. Over the following months, it was brought up again and again at the dinner table. Arguments weighed and reweighed. Paul and Rosie glowed at the idea of moving to the city, though in truth it was just a larger town of about 5,000 people. For me, the idea stirred mixed emotions. Leaving behind the house that had witnessed so much sorrow sounded like relief. And yet, it was still the only home I'd ever known. Every tree, every step of the path down to the creek, every sun-bleached stone carried memories, many bitter, but some sweet, tied to the days when my mother was alive. In July of 1960, at the dead of winter, we finally left. We carried little: clothing, keepsakes, family photographs, my mother's porcelain tea set. Everything else remained behind, along with a piece of ourselves. Aunt Louise's house in Fairview felt immense by comparison. 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, a proper parlour, and a separate dining room, a kitchen with both wood stove and gas range, astonishingly modern to us, and, most marvellous of all, an indoor bathroom with running water. "Each child will have their own room," Aunt Louise announced, to the squeals of delight from Paul and Rosie, who had only ever shared cramped corners before. Life in town required adjustments. My father, who had spent his life with hoe and plough, now worked behind the counter of a general store, making deliveries, tallying figures. His calloused hands now flipped ledger pages, and at night he often returned with a dazed, almost lost look, as if uncertain who he was in this new version of himself. I was enrolled at Our Lady of Grace, a school run by nuns. It was nothing like the little country schoolhouse I'd known. Here, classrooms were divided by grade. Teachers specialised in subjects. Uniforms were spotless, rules strict. On my first morning, surrounded by rows of girls in pleated skirts and crisp white blouses, a fear rose in me that I hadn't felt since those darker days back at the farm. "You'll get used to it," Aunt Louise assured me as she fussed with my navy tie for the 3rd time. "It's one of the best schools in the region. Graduating here opens doors." I kept my doubts silent. The other girls were daughters of shopkeepers, the pharmacist, the town clerk, even the mayor. I was the farmer's daughter, speaking with a rough accent, awkward in a second-hand uniform Aunt Louise had bartered for. Those first months I withdrew completely. I sat at the back, answered only when nuns called on me, skipped recess by hiding in the library under the excuse of study. It wasn't just shyness, it was armour, a wall to keep myself safe. And yet, in the classroom, I thrived. Books became my sanctuary, worlds to escape into. Sister Cecilia, who taught Portuguese, was the first to see something in me. One afternoon, she returned an essay I'd written describing the fields of my childhood, the clear creek, the golden leaves at winter's end. "You have a gift with words," she said. "You should consider becoming a teacher some day." It was the first time anyone had suggested I could aspire to more than housekeeping or following my mother's path. Her words lodged inside me like a fragile seed, unlikely to take, yet somehow beginning to grow. At home, life found a new rhythm. Aunt Louise, brisk and practical yet warm at heart, treated us as though we were her own. "A girl your age needs to learn more than just lessons," she would tell me on winter nights while teaching me to crochet. She should know how to run a house, sew a button, bake bread, but she also needs math, so no one cheats her, and good books, so she has her own mind. Her outlook straddled tradition and progress, hardly revolutionary, yet unusual for small-town Georgia in the early 60s. Meanwhile, my father slowly seemed to shed the weight that had bent him for years. He laughed more, told stories over supper, played with Rosie, helped Paul with his schoolwork. On some Saturdays, he even went to the cinema with colleagues, a thought unimaginable in our old life. It was on one such evening, when I was 15, that Aunt Louise spoke words which would unravel everything I had locked away. The house was quiet, my father and Paul at the movies, Rosie at a birthday party. Aunt Louise sat crocheting, and I read a book Sister Cecilia had lent me. Suddenly she broke the silence. "Eleanor," she said, unusually grave, "there's something I've wanted to ask for a long time." I looked up, startled. "What is it, Aunt?" She set aside her work and met my eyes. "What truly happened with your grandfather?" Her question struck me like ice water. For years no one had dared to speak of it. It was the family's unspoken ghost. He slipped, hit his head. It was an accident," I stammered, my throat dry. She held my gaze, eyes sharp yet kind. "I've suspected otherwise. I'm not here to judge, Eleanor. I just want to understand." I bristled. Understand what? But I knew exactly what she meant. "When I visited back then, I noticed how you flinched when he entered the room, the way your eyes, your mother's eyes, had lost their sparkle. That wasn't just grief, I recognized it." She hesitated, inhaling deeply. "Because I went through something similar at your age." Her confession cracked something inside me. Silent tears spilled before I could stop them. "No one would have believed me," I whispered. "He was respected, and I was just a child." "I would have believed," she said simply. "That's why I stayed close after your mother passed. I saw the signs, but I had no proof. Then your father found out, didn't he?" The words poured out of me in a rush I could no longer contain. He saw what was happening. They fought, and then Grandpa fell." I broke off, unable to continue. Aunt Louise came to sit beside me, wrapping me in an embrace warm with both sorrow and understanding. For the first time since that night, I let myself truly weep, loud, wrenching sobs that shook me to the core. "Your father did what any man of honour would have done," she whispered once I calmed. "How did you know? How were you sure?" "When you live long enough, you learn to recognise certain things," she said with a weary sigh. "And besides, your father told me, soon after you moved here, he needed someone he could trust." I sat silent, absorbing this. So he had spoken, just not to me. "Why tell me this now?" I asked finally. She took my hands, her eyes fixed on mine. "Because you've carried this weight in silence for too long. You thought you had to protect your father, your siblings, even me. But secrets like this corrode the soul, Eleanor. They eat away at you. Believe me, I know. What happened wasn't your fault. It wasn't even your father's fault. The only guilty man has already paid. Now it's time for you to begin setting yourself free. That talk, though painful, became the real beginning of my healing. It wasn't some instant miracle. Nothing disappeared overnight. The scars stayed, but something inside shifted. I was no longer alone with the secret I had carried for years. Someone finally knew, understood, and didn't condemn me for the role I thought I had played in that nightmare. With time, and with Aunt Louise's guidance and my father's steady support, I learned to see myself not as a victim, but as a survivor. Every nightmare faced, every memory confronted, every new day lived fully was a quiet victory over the past that had tried to shape me. The scars remained, some only visible to me, others affecting how I trusted, chose, or loved. Yet scars are proof of healing too, reminders that even in the battles that could have destroyed us, we endured. So, through falls and rises, through pain and recovery, I grew into adulthood, not untouched, not flawless, but whole. And at last I held my life in my own hands. The years turned like the yellowed pages of an old book, some smooth, some rough, all part of the story that carried me here, to my 78th year. I sit now on this wooden porch in the same Georgia countryside where I was born. Time has silvered my hair, etched my face with lines that speak silently of lived years, bent my back a little, but my spirit remains unbroken. The 1960s brought great changes, not only for me, but for the whole nation. While America wrestled with upheaval, I was finishing school with the nuns in Fairview. Sister Cecilia, the one who first saw in me a spark beyond my circumstances, urged me to try for the Teachers' College. "You have a gift for teaching, Eleanor," she said firmly. "It would be a shame to waste it." And so, in 1965, at just 18, I began my first job as an elementary school teacher in a rural one-room schoolhouse, much like the one where I had once sat as a child. The worn desks, the mix of ages, the modest chalkboard, it all brought back bittersweet memories. But this time I stood at the front, guiding, protecting. That same year, my father remarried Louise, the woman who had been our safe harbour through the hardest storms. Nobody was surprised. Their companionship, nurtured quietly for years, had deepened into love. My siblings, Paul and Rosie, accepted it naturally. For them, Louise had long been more than an aunt. She had already been a mother. I remember their small wedding in the Fairview church. My father, nervous as a young man despite his 45 years, fidgeted with the ill-fitting borrowed suit. Louise, dignified in a pale blue dress with simple flowers tucked into her greying hair, glowed with a joy that was steady and restrained. The night before, he asked me softly on the porch, "Are you truly happy about this, Ellie?" "Of course, Dad," I answered honestly. "You both deserve this." Relieved, he nodded, and then added words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "I still wake some mornings thinking of your mother. I'll probably always love her." But I've learned that the heart can grow. It can love again without erasing what it felt before. Pain is like that too. It never vanishes, but we can learn to carry it without letting it crush us. It was the closest he ever came to speaking of that tragic night. He didn't need to say more. Between us, the silence held all the understanding words couldn't. A year later, I met Anthony, the Newtown doctor, fresh from Atlanta, brimming with ideals. Our paths first crossed when he came to vaccinate my students against polio. "Does the teacher need her shot too?" he teased, as I lined up the children. I answered with my usual formality, my armour against the world. But in the following months, he returned often, checking vision, lecturing on hygiene, always finding an excuse to linger, always finding my eyes. At first I resisted. The walls I had built since girlhood made me wary of men, of intimacy, of trust. My friends teased me about being single, never realising the abyss that lay behind my refusal. Not every woman needs a husband, I would say. And it was true in part. I had built a meaningful life of work, family, and books. but it was also fear speaking. Louise, practical as ever, broke through my defences one quiet Sunday. "I know your fear, Eleanor," she said while we prepared lunch, "but if you keep running from love, you let that man, your grandfather, keep ruling your life from the grave. Don't let him win." Her words struck like lightning. I realised I'd been living in a prison of my own making. So, in the summer of 1967, I finally agreed to dinner with Anthony and Marietta. I was so nervous I couldn't touch the appetizers. "Relax," he smiled. "It's just dinner. I'm not proposing yet." That yet should have frightened me, but instead I laughed. His honesty disarmed me. Our relationship grew gently, at my pace. He never pressed, never questioned my sudden withdrawals, never pushed past my comfort. One night by the pond, under a sky thick with stars, I told him everything. About my mother, my grandfather, the night my father killed to save me. I spoke with my eyes fixed on the water, terrified of losing him. When I finally dared to look, I saw tears on his face. "Thank you for trusting me," he whispered. "Nothing you've said changes how I feel. If anything, my admiration has only grown." He held my hands with a tenderness that promised safety. We married the next year, 1968, in the same little church where my father had wed Louise. It was a simple country wedding, food prepared by neighbours, music from a local band. The early years weren't easy. My mind had chosen to trust Anthony, but my body remembered differently. Nightmares, panic, sudden recoils. Triggers came unbidden. Anthony's patience never wavered. "We're not in a hurry," he would remind me. "We have a lifetime." And in 1970, our first child arrived. A strong, healthy boy we named Charles, in honour of my mother Caroline. His birth was difficult, tangled with shadows of memory, but also healing. For the first time I felt the future opening wide before me. But when they placed that tiny bundle in my arms, something inside me shifted forever. "I'll protect you," I whispered to the baby, staring back at me with wide blue eyes so similar to my own. "Nothing and no one will ever harm you while I'm alive." It was a vow that echoed the one my father had once made to me, late but real. One circle closed that day, and another began. 2 years later, our family grew again with the birth of Mary, a dark-haired little girl with an effortless smile and an iron will that would define her character for life. The 1970s slipped by in a blur of diapers, wobbly first steps, first words, restless nights with feverish children, short trips to Atlanta to see Anthony's parents, and the ordinary joys that slowly patched up the wounds of the past. I continued teaching and eventually became principal of the very school where I had started my career. But in 1980, at the age of 33, I faced another deep loss. My father collapsed from a massive heart attack while tending the orchard in his backyard in Fairview. Louise found him lying among the orange trees he loved so dearly. He was only 60. His funeral felt surreal. In the same cemetery where, years earlier, we had buried my grandfather, we now laid my father to rest. 2 men as opposite as night and day, connected only by blood, not by character or values. As I stood watching his coffin lower into the ground, a storm gathered on the horizon, dark clouds sweeping in with fierce winds and heavy rain. It felt as though the sky itself was mourning that humble man who had carried the weight of his choices in silence, never once complaining, always protecting his daughter. "Even the heavens came to say goodbye," murmured Paul, my brother, now 31, married with 3 children of his own. The rain fell harder, just as the last shovelfuls of earth covered the coffin. Unlike many who ran for cover, we remained, me, Paul, Rosie, Louise, Anthony, and my little ones, standing there soaked, letting the water mix with our tears in a kind of unspoken baptism. At that moment, drenched and grieving, I felt an unexpected peace. I understood how crucial faith had been in guiding my life. Not a rigid, ritualistic kind of faith, but a quiet trust, that even in the fiercest storms a greater purpose exists, one not always clear at first. This faith didn't arrive suddenly in a single epiphany. It grew slowly, forged through hardships and trials. It started when I was a frightened child, staring up at the night sky, feeling a presence greater than myself. It deepened when, against all odds, I found in Anthony not only a husband, but a partner who rebuilt my broken trust. God writes straight with crooked lines, Louise used to remind me. As a girl, I didn't fully grasp it, but over time the meaning crystallized. How else could one explain that a girl so abused, traumatized and nearly destroyed could not only survive but thrive? That despite everything, I found love, built a family, carved out a meaningful career. That the very hands once wounded had learned to heal, to teach, to create. That same faith carried me through the years that followed, when Charles, at 15, nearly lost his ability to walk after a terrible accident. When Mary, at 20, revealed she was pregnant and abandoned by her boyfriend. Even in 1995, when Anthony was diagnosed with the cruel cancer that stole him from me in less than a year, faith never left my side. For 6 long months I cared for him at home, watching his strong body fade day by day. I asked myself endlessly why someone so good had to leave so young, only 55. Why, after all I had endured, was I asked to bear this too? No answers came, maybe none exist. But what I learned is that faith doesn't mean having all the answers. It means trusting even when the questions remain. On the night Anthony passed, I was alone at his side. My children had gone to fetch the priest, honouring their father's last request. I held his cold, weak hand while his breath grew heavier. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, the same words he had spoken to me countless nights when nightmares haunted me. His morphine-clouded eyes found mine. With effort, he spoke his final words. "You are the strongest person I've ever known." Then, as peacefully as he had lived, he slipped away. Though the pain was unbearable, I also felt calm. I knew our love didn't end there, that something greater awaited beyond this life. Once more I had to rebuild. I retired from teaching but remained active, dedicating myself to helping women and children in crisis, perhaps because I knew better than most how vital it is to have someone believe in you when your whole world collapses. I watched my children grow and create families of their own. Charles followed his father into medicine, specialising in paediatrics. Mary, after raising her daughter Sophia alone, became a lawyer defending victims of abuse, a path that felt destined, given her past. My 5 grandchildren grew up hearing stories of the grandfather they never met, of their great-grandmother Caroline, of life long ago in rural Georgia. But the darkest truths of our family's history I kept from them. Some burdens are too heavy to pass down, and maybe they never need to know. Now, at 78, when I look back, I see a winding road filled with triumphs and failures, love and grief. I see a little girl who became a strong woman, not despite her pain, but in many ways because of it. Each trial taught me something about resilience, forgiveness, and the power to begin again. If I could speak to that 10-year-old girl who lost everything in one day, I'd tell her the road will be brutal, but she carries a strength she cannot yet imagine. I'd tell her the scars will never fade, but they will become marks of honour, testimonies of survival. I'd tell her above all that she is never alone, that there are good people ready to reach out, and that God never abandons us, even when his ways feel incomprehensible. This is my story, a story woven with pain, but also redemption, a story of how faith can carry us through life's fiercest storms, a story that I hope might offer comfort to someone right now walking through their own valley of shadows, wondering if the light will ever return. If you are going through something like this, remember, you are not alone. The wounds that feel impossible today can become your strength tomorrow. You are stronger than you think, more loved than you realise, and your story is far from over. And if my journey touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Press the like button so others may find courage for their own battles. Subscribe to the channel for more true accounts of survival and faith shared here every day. Because, in the end, that's what saves us. Knowing we are not alone, that others have walked through the darkness and found their way back to the light. May God be with you, today and always.